The Sword and the Guardian. The clearing was bathed in a soft golden glow as the first rays of sunlight pierced through the ancient trees that surrounded it. Towering, gnarled trunks with thick, twisting branches seemed to reach toward the heavens, their leaves whispering in the breeze, as though sharing secrets older than the world itself. In the center of this clearing, nestled within the heart of the forest, stood an ancient stone pedestal. It had been there for as long as the villagers could remember, its stone worn by centuries of rain, wind, and time. Upon this pedestal rested a sword unlike any other. Its hilt was intricately carved with delicate runes, glowing faintly in the soft light, as though imbued with an energy that called out to those who dared to approach. The blade shimmered, reflecting the sunlight in a cascade of dazzling glints, but despite its beauty, there was something forbidding about it. It had been embedded in the stone for as long as anyone could remember, refusing to be moved, despite the countless attempts by those who sought to claim it. The villagers spoke of its power, passing down the legend through generations. They claimed it was a relic from a time when gods and mortals walked the earth together, a weapon of unimaginable power that had the ability to change the fate of kingdoms. No one knew the true story behind it, only that it was a symbol of something greater, something ancient and unfathomable. The tradition had long since become a rite of passage for those who sought glory. Young men, full of ambition and pride, would come from distant lands, drawn by the promise of power and the belief that they were the ones worthy of pulling the sword free. They came in all forms, warriors clad in iron, kings with divine right, magi wielding ancient spells. Yet all of them had failed. The sword remained stubbornly lodged in its stone prison, unyielding and indifferent to their struggles. It was said that the sword chose its wielder, but none could explain how. Perhaps it was a test of strength or of lineage. Maybe it was about more than just physical might. It had to be, given the countless powerful individuals who had tried and failed. And so, the sword remained a silent guardian of its mystery, sitting in the heart of the forest, while the villagers lived their lives, passing down the tale to their children, who would one day try their hand at the impossible task of claiming it. No one thought it would ever be claimed, not in their lifetime, nor the next. It had become something of a joke, a tale to amuse the children. The sword would sit, waiting for someone worthy, but no one ever seemed to be. Amidst this backdrop of quiet reverence and forgotten hope, there stood the guardian. She was as old as the sword itself, her presence as ancient and eternal as the stones that surrounded her. She watched over the sword, guarding it with a quiet vigilance that few could understand. She was not human, and the villagers had long since stopped guessing at her true origins. Some whispered she was an elf, others thought her a goddess, but none dared to ask her directly. Her violet eyes gleamed with the wisdom of centuries, and her silver hair cascaded like liquid moonlight, falling around her shoulders in gentle waves. She was tall, elegant, and undeniably otherworldly, her presence commanding respect. The guardian was the sword's keeper, but she was also its judge. She had watched countless challengers come and go, none of them successful. With each attempt, she had seen the arrogance, the desperation, and the fleeting hopes of those who thought themselves worthy of the sword's power. She had seen their failure, time and time again, and she had grown indifferent to it. The sword was more than a simple test. It was a symbol, a reminder of a time long past, and a force that could not be swayed by the ambitions of mortals. She had watched them all, each one in turn, but today was different. Today, something shifted in the air, a tension that hung thick and heavy as a man approached. He was unlike the others. He was not garbed in royal armor, nor was he clad in the extravagant robes of a magician. His clothes were simple, a traveler's garb, worn and weathered from years of toil on the road. His boots were scuffed, his hands calloused. He was unremarkable in almost every way, and yet there was something about him that caught her attention. He approached the sword with a quiet determination, his eyes filled with a mixture of awe and something else, something that caught her off guard. Most challengers were brimming with pride or desperation, convinced they were the ones who could finally pull the sword free. But this man, this simple traveler, was different. He did not wear arrogance or desperation. Instead, he exuded a quiet resolve, as though he knew he had nothing to prove. And for a moment, the Guardian found herself intrigued. As he reached the sword, his fingers hovered above the hilt, tracing the ancient runes with a gentle touch. The Guardian, watching from the edge of the clearing, could not help but scoff softly to herself. Another human, she thought. Another fool who believes they are the one who will succeed. You think you can succeed where kings and warriors have failed? She asked, her voice smooth and lilting, but laced with a subtle edge of mockery. What makes you think you're worthy? The man looked at her, his eyes calm and unyielding. There was no arrogance in his gaze, just quiet resolve. Maybe I'm not, he replied softly, but I'm here, and I'm willing to try. The Guardian raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite herself. Most who approached the sword were either brimming with arrogance or driven by some desperate need for power. But this man, this simple traveler, had none of that. She was certain he would fail, but there was something about him that made her pause. Very well, she said, stepping aside with a dramatic sweep of her arm. By all means, show us what you're capable of. The man nodded, and with that, he approached the sword, his movements steady and purposeful. He placed his hands on the hilt, his fingers tracing the ancient runes as if committing them to memory. The clearing fell into an unnatural silence, the tension palpable in the air as he prepared himself. Then, with a deep breath, he pulled. At first, there was no movement. The sword resisted, as it always did. The man's muscles strained, his jaw clenched, and his feet dug into the earth. For a moment, the Guardian felt vindicated in her skepticism. She watched, her expression one of quiet amusement, waiting for the inevitable failure. But then something strange happened. The runes on the hilt began to glow, faintly at first, and then brighter, until the entire clearing was bathed in radiant light. The stone beneath the sword cracked with a low, resonant hum, and the air seemed to thrum with an energy that sent shivers down her spine. The man let out a roar, his body straining with effort, and with a final, mighty pull, the sword came free. The clearing fell into a stunned silence. The man stood there, the sword in his hands, its blade gleaming like liquid starlight. He looked at it with a mixture of awe and disbelief, as though he couldn't quite comprehend what had just happened. He had done it. He had succeeded. The Guardian stood still, her mouth slightly agape, for the first time in centuries, at a loss for words. The unassuming human had succeeded where countless others had failed. Her disbelief gave way to something unexpected, laughter. It started as a soft chuckle, then grew into a full-throated, joyous laugh that echoed through the clearing. The man looked at her, confused, as she wiped a tear from her eye, her laughter subsiding into a warm, genuine smile. You actually did it," she said between fits of laughter, her voice filled with a mixture of astonishment and admiration. "Of all the people, it had to be you." He frowned, still holding the sword, its gleam reflecting in his eyes. "What's so funny?" The Guardian waved a hand dismissively, her smile widening. "Oh, nothing. It's just ironic. The sword chooses its wielder, you know. It's not about strength or lineage. It's about heart. And yours, it seems, is truer than most." He looked at the sword, then back at her, still trying to process what had just happened. "So, what happens now?" Her smile softened, and she stepped closer to him, her gaze now filled with something else, something almost gentle. "Now," she said, "you've earned a destiny. That blade is more than a weapon. It's a beacon, a symbol of hope. Wield it wisely, for it will test you in ways you cannot yet imagine." The man nodded, his grip tightening around the sword. "I'll do my best." The Guardian's eyes softened, a glimmer of hope flashing in her gaze. "I believe you will. For the first time in centuries, the Guardian felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps this unremarkable human was exactly what the world needed. And as he walked away, the sword gleaming in his hand, a new chapter began to unfold. The path of the sword-bearer. The sound of the man's footsteps echoed through the clearing as he walked away, the sword gleaming brightly in his hands. The Guardian watched him disappear into the forest, her mind racing with thoughts she had not entertained in centuries. It was rare for someone to succeed where so many others had failed, and even rarer for that person to be someone so ordinary. There was nothing extraordinary about him. He didn't possess the strength of a king or the magic of a wizard. He was just a man, humble in his appearance, yet somehow he had proven himself worthy. For the first time in eons, the Guardian felt a strange sense of curiosity stir within her. What was it about him? What made this simple traveler succeed where the greatest of warriors had not? Was it truly his heart, as she had claimed? Or was there something more at play? Something the sword had chosen in him that she could not yet understand. She stood there for a long time, watching the trees sway in the wind, lost in thought. The world around her was as still as it had always been, yet she felt a shift in the air, a change, an uncertain stirring that seemed to pulse with every passing moment. She had watched over the sword for centuries, keeping it safe, preventing any unworthy hands from claiming it. But now the world had changed, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for what was to come. But there was little time for reflection. She was bound to the stone, bound to the very place where the sword had stood for millennia. Her role as the Guardian was clear: watch over the sword, ensure that it remained safe. Yet, for the first time, she wondered if there was more to her purpose than just guarding a relic. She had always thought of herself as a silent watcher, an observer of time's slow passage. But now she felt the stirrings of something greater, something she couldn't yet fully grasp. Meanwhile, the man continued his journey, unaware of the impact his actions had set into motion. His path was uncertain, and the weight of the sword felt heavier with every step he took. He had come here in search of something, though he hadn't known exactly what. Perhaps it had been a desire for glory, for the chance to prove himself. Or perhaps it had been something deeper, something that had pulled him to this moment without him even realizing it. Whatever the reason, the sword was now his, and with it came a responsibility he had never imagined. He had no idea what was coming next. As the man walked through the forest, the weight of the sword began to feel different, heavier, not in a physical sense, but in a deeper, more intangible way. The blade, which had seemed so light when he first gripped it, now felt as though it was infused with some great power, some immense force that he could hardly comprehend. It wasn't like the swords he had wielded in the past, weapons forged for battle and war. This sword, this was something else entirely. It thrummed with an energy he couldn't describe, an energy that seemed to pulse through his hands and into his body. It was both exhilarating and terrifying. He could feel the weight of the legacy behind the sword, the countless hands that had tried and had failed to claim it. He could almost sense the presence of those who had come before him, their spirits lingering in the air, watching, waiting. It was as if the sword carried the echoes of their hopes and dreams, their triumphs and their failures. And now, those echoes were his to carry. The path ahead was uncertain. The sword had chosen him, but what was he supposed to do with it? The thought of wielding such a powerful weapon was daunting. He wasn't a hero. He had never been a hero. He was just a man, someone who had lived a simple life, far removed from the grand schemes of kings and conquerors. But now, it seemed, he had been thrust into something far greater than himself, and he couldn't turn back. As he continued through the forest, the trees began to thin, and he emerged into a small clearing. In the distance, he could see the smoke of a village rising from a valley below. The air was thick with the scent of burning wood, and the sound of shouting reached his ears. It was a sound he knew all too well, the sound of chaos, of conflict. He had heard it before, in the places he had passed through, in the towns ravaged by war, the villages torn apart by greed and power. But this This felt different. A cold shiver ran down his spine. Something about the village seemed wrong. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and instinctively he gripped the sword tighter, the hilt now familiar in his hands. It felt as though the sword itself was urging him forward, its presence growing stronger as he approached. It was as if it knew something he didn't. A warning, a call to action. He walked closer, moving carefully through the trees, his senses alert. The smoke grew thicker as he drew near, and the sounds of shouting became clearer. His heart pounded in his chest as he reached the edge of the clearing and peered through the brush. What he saw stopped him in his tracks. A band of marauders had descended on the village. They were rough, violent men, clad in dirty armor and carrying crude weapons. The villagers, defenseless and terrified, were being herded into a corner, their homes set ablaze, their cries for help rising into the air. The marauders laughed, taunting their victims, enjoying the terror they had wrought. For a moment, the man stood there, frozen. He had never been a warrior, never trained to fight in battles. He had never had the desire to be a hero. But now, as he watched the destruction unfold before him, something inside him stirred. A deep, instinctual pull that came from somewhere deep within. It wasn't the sword, not directly. It was something inside him. Something the sword had unlocked, something that had been dormant for too long. He felt a surge of purpose, a clarity that cut through his doubt. He was no hero. He wasn't even sure he was worthy of this sword. But he had made a choice, and this was his moment. Without thinking, he stepped out from the trees and into the clearing, the sword at the ready. The marauders stopped laughing when they saw him, their eyes narrowing as they took in the sight of the man standing before them, sword gleaming in his hand. "Well, well," one of them sneered, his voice thick with mockery. "What do we have here? A hero, perhaps?" The man's gaze didn't waver. "Not a hero," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the fear that gripped his heart. "Just someone who won't stand by and let this happen." Without waiting for a response, he moved. The sword sang through the air, its blade cutting through the chaos like a hot knife through butter. The first marauder fell with a shout, his weapon cleaved in two. The others hesitated for a moment, shocked by the sudden attack, but then they charged, furious at the audacity of this lone defender. But the man wasn't alone. The sword seemed to move with him, its power flowing through him like a second nature. His feet moved with a purpose he hadn't known he had, his strikes precise, fast, and fierce. The marauders were strong, but they were disorganized, caught off guard by the sudden attack. One by one, they fell, the sound of clashing steel filling the air. The villagers watched in stunned silence as the man fought, the sword flashing with each strike, its gleaming blade cutting through the air with an almost otherworldly grace. He was no seasoned warrior, but with the sword in his hand, he moved like one. The power of the blade surged through him, and he fought not for glory, not for revenge, but for something else. A deep, burning desire to protect, to defend those who could not defend themselves. When the last of the marauders fell, the man stood in the middle of the clearing, panting, his body exhausted but triumphant. The villagers, their faces full of awe and gratitude, slowly began to approach, their eyes wide with wonder. They had seen it, the impossible. The man had defeated the marauders, the sword had chosen its wielder, and for the first time, he felt something stir within him. He was no hero, but perhaps in this moment, he had become something close to it. The unlikely hero. The village stood in stunned silence, the crackling of the flames now the only sound as the last of the marauders were either defeated or scattered into the woods, retreating into the dark corners of the forest. The dust had barely settled when the villagers who had been cowering in fear moments ago began to approach the man. They moved cautiously, as if unsure whether he was real or some kind of figment conjured by the sword itself. His stance was strong, but his gaze was soft, wearied by the conflict yet resolute, his grip still tight around the hilt of the gleaming blade. His heart pounded in his chest as he looked at the villagers. He wasn't a warrior, wasn't even someone with a title or purpose beyond surviving the road from place to place. And yet, he had done the unthinkable. He had defended these people. "Thank you," one of the villagers finally spoke, her voice trembling but full of gratitude. She was a middle-aged woman with lines of worry etched into her face. The exhaustion in her eyes told stories of a life spent surviving. But the look she gave him now was something new, something like hope. He looked down at the sword in his hands, unsure what to say. I didn't do it alone," he muttered, his words soft, still trying to make sense of what had happened. The blade in his hand hummed faintly, as though it was in tune with his thoughts, its energy still crackling around him. He wasn't sure if the villagers knew or even cared, but the sword wasn't just a tool. It had become part of him, and he had become part of it. "I didn't ask for this," he added, more to himself than to the villagers. He glanced up at them, suddenly self-conscious under their unwavering gazes. They were looking at him with reverence now, as though he were someone far greater than the simple man who had wandered into their village earlier that day. "You've given us hope," the woman continued, her voice steady now, though the tremble from earlier remained in the edges of her words. "We thought we were lost, that we'd never be free of their terror. But now we see a glimmer of light in the darkness." The weight of her words settled heavily on his shoulders. He hadn't come here to be a hero. He had never thought of himself that way. But in that moment, something inside him stirred, something he hadn't realized was there until now. Perhaps it was the sword, or perhaps it was the act of standing up when all seemed lost. The feeling was foreign to him, but it was undeniable. "I didn't do this for glory," he replied, his voice more firm now. "I just couldn't stand by and watch it happen." He looked down at the sword again. It had done more than help him fight. It had called something out of him, something buried deep inside. The sword was more than just a relic of legend. It was a catalyst, a force that had awakened him to something greater than himself. He could feel its weight, not just in his hands, but in his soul. The villagers began to gather around him, their eyes still wide, still filled with wonder. They were in awe, but there was a glint of something else in their eyes, a quiet trust that hadn't been there before. They were looking at him as though he were something extraordinary. One of the older men stepped forward. His hair was white, and his face lined with years of hard living, but his eyes were clear, and his voice was steady. "You've done something no one thought possible. You've proven that there's more to the sword than just strength. It chooses its wielder, yes, but what it really chooses is the heart. And you've shown us that your heart is as strong as the blade you wield." The man's gaze flicked up from the sword to meet the elder's eyes. A sense of confusion still lingered in him. He wasn't sure what he was meant to do with this newfound recognition. The villagers were placing their hope in him, but he wasn't sure if he was ready to carry that weight. The elder continued, "You've proven yourself more than worthy of that sword, my friend. But the road ahead will not be easy. There is more to this world than marauders and bandits. The sword, it calls for something greater." The man's heart skipped a beat at the elder's words. Something greater. He wasn't sure what the elder meant, but he knew in his gut that it was true. The sword had not just chosen him for a village's defense. It had chosen him for something far bigger. Before he could respond, the sound of distant voices reached his ears. Low murmurs at first, then growing louder. The villagers tensed, their faces turning toward the sounds. He turned as well, the weight of the sword still in his hands. His grip tightened instinctively, even though the sounds weren't threatening at first. The voices grew louder, and before long, a group of travelers appeared at the edge of the clearing. They were not villagers, nor were they the marauders from earlier. These people looked different, strange, cloaked in robes and armor that seemed too fine for the villages they were now entering. Their horses were pristine, and their eyes glinted with something sharp. The man felt a stirring inside him again, a warning from the sword, or perhaps from his instincts, but either way, he could feel it. These people were not here to celebrate his victory. Their intentions were unclear. One of them, a tall figure cloaked in deep crimson robes, raised a hand in greeting, though there was no warmth in his gesture. "We have heard of your victory, sword-bearer," the figure said, his voice rich with authority. "But you must know, that sword you wield is not just a symbol of hope. It is also a tool of power, and power, it is always sought after." The words sent a shiver down the man's spine. He wasn't sure who these people were, but the look in their eyes made it clear that their interest in the sword was not one of admiration. They had come for something else. And now, with his hand on the sword's hilt, the man understood that the challenges before him were far from over. The sword had chosen him for something greater, but what was that something? He couldn't shake the feeling that these strangers, with their sharp eyes and cold tones, were only the beginning of a far larger journey. He didn't know what lay ahead, but one thing was clear: the sword had given him a new purpose, and he would carry it, whatever that purpose was, with the same resolve that had driven him to fight for these villagers. The elder stepped forward, eyeing the strangers warily. "The sword is not for you to claim," he said, his voice firm. "It has found its wielder." The cloaked figure smiled, but it was not a warm smile. It was a smile full of calculation, full of plans that stretched beyond this village, beyond this moment. "We shall see," he said cryptically. With that, the group turned and began to retreat back into the forest, their horses' hooves sinking into the earth with an ominous echo. The man stood there, his heart heavy, his mind swirling with uncertainty. The sword was not just a weapon, it was a key to something much bigger than he had ever imagined. And now, the real journey had begun. The weight of destiny. The sun had begun to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the village as the strange group of travelers disappeared into the forest. The man stood there for a moment, staring after them, his hand still resting on the hilt of the sword. Something about their words lingered in the air, heavy with unspoken truths. "The sword is not for you to claim." The elder's voice echoed in his mind, a stark contrast to the cryptic tone of the cloaked figure. They had made their intentions clear, but what did it all mean? What was it that he had unwittingly become a part of? The villagers were still gathering around, whispering among themselves in hushed tones, their faces filled with both awe and wariness. They were no longer just looking at the man with gratitude. Now they looked at him with a sense of expectation, as if the simple act of defending them had somehow transformed him into something more. But the man felt no different. In fact, he felt more uncertain than ever before. His grip on the sword tightened, and he glanced at it once more. The blade had always gleamed with an otherworldly light, but now it seemed to hum, pulsing gently with an energy that seemed to resonate through him. The sword and its power were now a part of him, something he could neither deny nor fully understand. One of the villagers, a young man no older than his mid-20s, stepped forward. His eyes were filled with reverence, but there was a question in them as well. "What will you do now, sword-bearer?" he asked, his voice full of wonder and curiosity. "You've defeated them, but they'll come again. And if those strangers are any indication, we may face something far worse next time." The words were simple, but the weight behind them felt like a hammer striking his chest. "What will you do now?" The question echoed in his mind. He had never thought beyond the moment. He had only ever taken one step at a time, moving forward when he had to, surviving when it was necessary. But now, it seemed as though his life had become something else entirely, a path that had been thrust upon him, with no choice but to follow it. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice quieter than he intended. He could feel the eyes of the villagers on him, all of them waiting for some kind of answer, some direction from him, but he had none to offer. All he knew was that the sword had chosen him, and now, it seemed that the choices were no longer his alone to make. The elder, still standing at the edge of the group, spoke up. His voice was calm, yet there was a firmness in it that seemed to cut through the uncertainty that hung in the air. "The sword has chosen you," he said, "but you must understand that it is not just a weapon. It is a symbol of something much greater, something that goes beyond this village, beyond the enemies that threaten us. The sword has chosen you because it knows you have the strength to face whatever comes next." The man turned to face the elder, his heart heavy with doubt. "I don't know if I have that strength," he said quietly. "I'm just a man, no different than any of these villagers. I never asked for this, never wanted it. I was just trying to survive, just trying to get by. Now I'm supposed to be something more." The elder's gaze softened, and for a moment, there was a flicker of understanding in his eyes. "No one ever asks for destiny," he replied. "Destiny finds us, whether we seek it or not. And when it does not care for our doubts or our wishes. It simply asks us to walk the path that is set before us. And you, sword-bearer, are already walking it." The words resonated deeply within him, stirring something primal, something ancient. The path before him was unclear, winding through uncertainty and fear, but the sword, its hum, its power, was urging him forward. He couldn't deny it. He had felt the weight of its call, pulling him toward something greater than the simple life he had once known. "Then what am I supposed to do?" he asked, looking at the elder. "Where do I even begin?" The elder's eyes grew distant, as if he were seeing something beyond the village, beyond the forest that lay in front of them. "You begin by understanding that your role is not just to defend. It is to lead. You are now the beacon of hope for all those who are oppressed, who are waiting for someone to rise and challenge the powers that seek to control them. You are not just a protector. You are a force of change." The man felt a wave of unease wash over him at the elder's words. The leader. He had never thought of himself that way. He had never thought of himself as anyone special, let alone someone capable of leading a rebellion, a resistance against whatever forces were brewing in the shadows. "But how?" he whispered. "How do I lead? I'm just one man." The elder's gaze turned back to him, steady and unwavering. "You are not just one man," he said, his voice firm. "You are the sword-bearer, and that makes all the difference." There was a long silence, one that stretched out for what felt like an eternity. The sword in the man's hand seemed to pulse with an energy that mirrored his own rising uncertainty. He had never asked for any of this, and yet now he was caught in a destiny he could not escape. The sword was not just a weapon. It was a call to action, a challenge he was now bound to face. The man took a deep breath, looking around at the villagers who had gathered, still watching him with hope in their eyes. They were placing their trust in him. And in that moment, he realized that the weight of that trust was both a gift and a burden. But it was his to carry. He could not, would not, let them down. "I'll do what I can," he said finally, his voice steady. "I may not know everything, but I'll learn. I'll fight for you. I'll fight for everyone who needs it. I promise." The elder nodded, a small, approving smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Then you have already taken the first step. The road ahead will be difficult, sword-bearer. You will face challenges that will test your very soul. But remember this, the sword does not just choose those who are strong in body. It chooses those who are strong in heart." The man nodded, though doubt still lingered in the back of his mind. He wasn't sure if he was strong enough for this journey, for the path that lay ahead. But he knew one thing for certain. The sword had chosen him, and now he had a responsibility to carry it, to face whatever trials were to come. As the night began to fall, the village grew quiet again, the sounds of celebration replaced by the soft whispers of the wind. The sword-bearer stood at the edge of the clearing, the sword held firmly in his hands, its blade reflecting the last rays of the setting sun. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but one thing was clear. He was no longer just a traveler. He was a man on a mission, a man bound to something greater than himself. And as he looked toward the horizon, where the darkening sky met the unknown, he knew that the real journey was just beginning. The road ahead would not be easy, but he was ready to face it. For the first time in his life, he felt something stir within him, a fire that he hadn't known existed. The sword had awakened something deep inside him, and now he was bound to it, bound to the destiny that awaited. The path ahead was uncertain, but the sword would guide him.